Does anybody have any questions? And I know we had a long time of them, so if you want to put your hands up, I can start to keep track. You want to go ahead first? So two things. Do we need to do it? And if we do it, how do we do it?
Yeah.
All right. And I think, Andy, you actually spoke to that briefly, which was don't count it by the number of data sets necessarily, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that because the whole topic is still in its infancy, I don't think that a lot of strategic thought has taken place around measurement frameworks. So the examples that I gave, I think were a start in terms of customer satisfaction. There is a usage element to it. There is a revenue element to it. But I know that, you know, to me it seems like the train has left the station and everyone's trying to catch up now. And maybe, you know, I think part of what needs to take place, which I think is where you're going, is that taking one step back at a sort of more macro level to actually define a measurement framework, you know, would actually help inform where you should go and where you should start. So I think that's something that should happen.
Ron, you want to chime in there?
Yeah, I was just, so I agree with Andy. I think you do have to step back and you do have to look at this. But at the end of the day, if we don't create economic value, i.e. jobs, or we don't create social good, i.e. a better quality of life, I think we're all wasting our time. I mean, that's, you know, that's what we think is in this data, is the ability to improve the lives for ourselves, our parents, and our kids, and create jobs for the next generation. And so that's, I think that's why, you know, there's 62 or 3 federal, you know, national governments and 400 total governments around the world that are signing on to these principles because they've bought into that. They honestly believe that there is value in this natural resource, if you like, this data that has the potential to create jobs and create social good. And that's really what we're doing it for.
Yeah, so I hear 2 things. One of them is to use pre-existing metrics. Don't reinvent those, because those, you know, we have to tie to what we know is important. And secondly, there is some cases where we need to bear down on this topic specifically. And just before we leave that question, have you seen anyone start to do that in any capacity?
Not that I've seen.
So this is early days for this one. Okay, great. Saw a hand behind.
And yeah, so we're just going to use a mic because we can pick it up.
Thanks. I'm Jim Suderman from the City of Toronto.
Hi, Jim.
And, I want to try and set hopefully provocative context to my question. So is big data something like exploding the first nuclear device? Is it changing the world? So my, Bianca, one of your slides, big data is big, inspired me to say with big data comes big responsibility.
Yep.
And I think it follows a little bit on the question immediately before. Have we looked at where big data has been effectively used to improve decision-making?
Right.
That's part A. So
Yep.
I'll throw out the example of global warming data. Has been highly controversial in a political forum. And part B is, would any of you speak to some of the dynamics that are, how do you say, less interested in the public good, but still interested in big data?
And could you expand a bit on the second part, dynamics at less interest in the public good?
Sure. So one thinks maybe of the National Security Agency.
Okay.
Clearly a big data proponent there, but not necessarily one that it builds public trust.
Right, okay. So to the first question, have we looked where it's been used effectively in other places? And I think some case studies beyond the smart cities sort of discussion, like in a broad public policy context. Anybody want to jump in on that one in terms of case? Ron, you want to go ahead?
Let me just give you one example that I think is interesting, and it's happening right down the street, and that's why it's so interesting. So those of you who are connected at all to healthcare know that about 8% of babies in Canada are born premature, and about 25% of those will get a disease called late onset neonatal sepsis. So at at Sick Kids Hospital, in conjunction with the hospital in Providence, Rhode Island, and one in China. They are mapping now 2,000 data sets per second for these kids that they're monitoring. So blood gases, heart rate, respiratory issues, all sorts of things, to try to monitor and to find out and to diagnose and to treat LONS, this late onset neonatal sepsis quicker. So this is something that's real, that's happening today.
Is it affecting public policy?
Absolutely, it will. Absolutely will. It's $100,000 to treat a premature baby that's got this. So you can imagine the dollars flowing to healthcare, $49 billion a year in Ontario alone. And so, this is a fairly significant issue, and unfortunately, a sizable percentage of those premature babies die from this disease. So if you're one of those parents, you will spend whatever it takes to make sure this doesn't happen. But big data is being used to be a more effective treatment to diagnose, to monitor, and to treat this particular disease. So there's something that's happening down the street as well as in 2 other countries in the world, and they're coordinating together and gathering the data and analyzing the data together.
Okay, and Len, you got a quick one, then we'll move on to the second half. Yeah.
Just also is another example in the emergency management at the World Health Organization, but also across many city and level government too. Big data on disease and outbreak using geospatial-based location is actually being used to predict when the disease outbreak might be, and being able to use that as a way to help government to deal with emergency, but also help with the care practitioner and also help with the citizen itself. So that is a very much one initiative is going right now, and City of Toronto is also participating big time in this.
Right. Thanks. So to the second question, with organizations maybe less interested in big data, but maybe not the way that all of us would like them to be. This also corresponds to something we saw on Twitter asking about the Information Privacy Commissioner, because that was what sprung to mind when you started to speak, is that there's pre-existing organizations that layer into policy in this realm. And I don't know if anybody here would like to speak to that one in terms of how privacy is currently being included in policy.
Privacy can almost be a fetish. Can we
Right.
say where people interpret data in different ways to reach
Right.
different conclusions?
Oh, so in terms of like having to, the way that you said with the,
globe is not one.
right, okay, that one. And I think I read yesterday, with big data comes a requirement for big judgment as well, like for being aware of what you're saying in terms of the data. And I think this is where the human piece comes in. And I don't know if we might want to think about the less technological part of this and more the service level in terms of people who can understand and interpret data. So
Well, one
kind
of the
looking
things which
to you
I've
too.
always said, and this I've said this for years before we got into big data and open data, is that you can always make data tell any story that you want it to.
Yeah. Yeah, statistics.
And so, that is a fundamental issue. Some of you may have seen the sort of release today around the at the federal level, and the fact that conclusions around job vacancies had been taken off Kijiji job vacancy data, and it was sort of subsequently shown that the Kijiji as a source of reliable employment stats was maybe not quite as valid as what the government would have hoped in its announcement. So it is obviously a huge issue, and I think the point that Bianca made is absolutely fundamental, is that you can have as big a data sets as you like, and you can have hundreds of data scientists and all the right technology and tools, but that human judgment element is fundamental. Yeah. And we talk about evidence-based decision-making, and the fact that evidence of the fact that something happened in the past is a potential predictor that it's going to happen in the future. And that may be the case, but let's remember, it might not be. Mm-hmm. And so you can't just have a totally academic and scientific view to this. You need to have other skill sets and competencies and other channels into your decision-making process that actually bring other elements to the decision-making table, so that you don't make the wrong evidence-based decision because the environment has fundamentally changed.
Yeah, and I think you're providing advice at the same time with the question, is that context has to be repeated all the time, right? I think that's very valid. Any other hands on this side of the room? So those were the two we saw. Anybody got one?
Maybe I'll just ask one if nobody else.
If you got one, sure.
Yeah,
We
sure.
got some more stuff. So.
I guess just to follow up on that is a question about how much hypothesis-based analysis is taking place. So we've heard about lots of different data sets being released. and Andy, you talked about the UK National Pupil Database, looking at what was in that database and what could it demonstrate. So just would be interested in some of the panel's views on to what extent certain hypotheses have been identified, and we expect some analysis and some insights to be coming out of that. And one example might be that there's a correlation between income and outcome in a specific area. So is there any kind of rich areas that we might be able to expect in the near future?
So in terms of what's going on right now, like are there some?
Yeah, so there could be some critical
exciting
policy questions that the government has on its mind, whether it's health, education, transportation, that we think there's a few different data sets out there that might be able to tap into either through internally or through sort of the wisdom of the crowds. By releasing that information publicly, we might be able to get at some of those answers.
Yeah. Anybody got one? I can go. I got one right off the top of my head, just talking public consultation about transportation. It's been a challenge in the city and within the province to have Metrolinx and the Toronto Transit Commission sharing. This is a case where if you had all of this data in one place and started to look at it jointly, as we try to understand transportation, I think that's an example where you have different agencies where there's a lot of value. There could be a lot of value in bringing that data together in analysis and in consultation. I don't know. That's one that springs to mind 'cause it's a hot topic right now. Ron, you got one?
And Metrolinx is committed to open data and to releasing data, and they understand exactly that it's a much more informed and rich conversation if people have the same level of understanding around data, information around transportation, cost of transportation, traffic flows, all those sorts of things, population projections.
Yeah. And another place I've seen it is city planning. It's a fascinating example because I attended the Mirvish development that was proposed. Those big condos, seeing some nods, yes. And so immediately the discussion was rather emotional because it turned into there's going to be no sun, there's going to be no parking, there's going to be no infrastructure capacity, there's going to be no, and you sit and you think, and it's like, well, you could bring all of that information to the table. Maybe you wouldn't like what you'd hear, maybe you would, but it would help inform a discussion that you could move forward from. There's a huge education opportunity in bringing this data into any conversation where there's a consultation element. So I think like that's one, because there's this assumption, sometimes what everybody's assuming isn't correct. Sometimes it is, but it would be good it helps all of us move forward when we have debates and have discussions to have that stuff at hand. So those are just two that I have seen firsthand. Lan?
Another area too is related to community development. As you know, city has a number of neighborhood priority,
Yep.
And we have in the past few years developed what we call a well-being neighborhood index. That you can actually have using geospatial data, looking at the income level, looking at crime rate, looking at housing, looking at business, looking at age, looking at all different kind of indicator to help the government also in making decision around policy decision around investment, around budget, around service level delivery, and at the same time releasing this data for community also to deal with some of the area that they can actually help themselves, right, and producing a certain good or services that are actually coming from the grassroots.
Yeah.
So we found out that is one of the area that actually present a lot of very exciting opportunity using this indicator, and it came from all source of also of data, not just within the city as well.
And I think that's an interesting topic. The crime data, for example, gets us back to the human discussion about ethics, because you can have crime data that could be helpful, you could have crime data that could be hurtful, because if you're just indicating a place where there's issues and you're not committing to helping resolve those issues, you're actually further cementing the existing issue, right? So this is one of those, how are we all responsible with the data that it's used, I think, in these sort of policy discussions. Did you guys have a couple?
Well, I mean, I kind of think about this at a very macro level. And I mean, fundamentally, I think that the opportunity for government with respect to big data is to do a much better job at understanding what are the pathways that citizens take through their consumption of public services, be it the health system or the education system or the social services system, and understanding there's connections between those. The extent to which you can actually start to profile the types of outcomes that have happened based on certain profiles of citizen does actually inform policy development in terms of how to achieve better outcomes, but more significantly, it actually allows you to change the rules of the game. Because from an intervention perspective, if you can start to identify that a certain type of child who has certain characteristics and family demographic background in a certain area has certain characteristics when they're 7 years old, then it's much better to start interventions that are targeted when they're 7 years old than, 20 years later when they're unemployed and maybe they've been incarcerated for 5 years. So that's a simple example to make the point, but that is the big opportunity that big data, I think, presents government.
Great. Okay, so we're going to wrap up, but I just wanted to have Kevin and Jeff maybe both speak to that one. Jeff, you want to go first?
I just want to maybe a couple of quick observations more than anything else, but perhaps we have to begin to deliberately think about the framework by which we make certain decisions, right? So if we ask ourselves, what is it that we don't currently know that if we knew would help us to make a better decision? It's the kind of analysis or structure that we may each need to take within our respective areas of work to help to drive out a better decision. Number two, there's not going to be one source of data. There are going to be multiple sources of data. And so the correlation effect is going to be very important to help us to understand what this piece means versus what this piece means and what's the relationship. And maybe the final point, collaboration. To me,
Yeah.
making a decision in this environment really requires several points of view and several minds to come together. So how are we actually marshalling the right people with the right perspectives to help us to make this decision? And I would say right in front of us, I think, is a great example of what is playing out here. Big data, complexity, and decision making. Let's take a look at the missing airline and the various amounts of data and perspectives and decisions and conclusions that we're all trying to make as to where this plane is and what happened to it. I think that is reflective of the kind of challenge that we're going to face as we try to work in this big data environment.
I think, and maybe Kevin to wrap it up.
Yeah, and in that regard, I think the challenge is going to be, because it's a huge challenge, it's a huge initiative, is what's the value proposition? Why are we doing it? So what's the value that's coming out the other end? And I was on my way here today, listening to CBC, and I'm sure I'm going to get some of the facts wrong, but in the end, it was about they were talking about it was like a kids helpline, and what the modality that they're finding where kids want to talk and be heard is through texting. So it's not a phone line, it's a text line, and they're just looking for somebody to listen. And what they did is, out of collecting that data, they found that for certain kinds of issues, it correlated with certain days of the week, right? So I forget I think it was more around eating disorders and things like that. They found that those kinds of challenges came through more on Mondays and Tuesdays for one reason, or Sundays and Mondays for one reason or another. And I think then if we look at that as saying, there's the value that we can use out of creating or having access to that data set, is that we'll be able to create something of value. In this case, it's social good and things of that sort. But because there is so much data, there's so much we could do it, I think we have to be, steering away from it being an academic exercise and what's the value proposition goes along with it, and let that drive the decision.
Great. Thanks, Kevin. Okay, I think that does it. And I think a few of us are hanging around for the reception. So if you had additional questions, just want to make sure that you still have a chance to get them answered. And a big thank you to everybody on the panel here. That was a lot of insight. That was really fun. Thank you.
So just, I think this is on. Is this on now? Okay. Okay. So just very quickly to again echo our thanks on behalf of IPAC and ICE for a really fantastic discussion, and really appreciate all the contributions from everybody in the room, and especially to our panel. And we've got a certificate of thanks for each of the panel members, and a donation is being made in your names to the Lieutenant Governor of Ontario's Aboriginal Youth Literacy Initiative. So again, thank you very much for taking the time to contribute to the discussion today.
And I just want to thank all the people who made this happen today. I was not one of them, but I was copied on all the emails. So I can tell you There was a lot of work that went into preparing this day. So I'd like to thank Adam Flores at FedDev Ontario, Davia Rasaneagam from City of Toronto, Catherine Tramzek from, and you saw Catherine helping everybody in today from Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing, Dan Rosen from the City of Toronto. Dan was one of the main organizers today. He came, he was really sick, and everybody sent him home, so he's actually not here any longer. And Marta Guzik from IPAC. So thank you to all of the people who organized this session today.